Okay, looking at Neoclassicism, this is chapter 6 in the book, page 389. So Neoclassicism is a movement, more or less, or a subgenre, I guess you could say. It lasted for about 30 years, between 1920 and 1950, and it is basically restraint. Okay, so we've seen a lot of crazy things happen in the 20th century, even the late 19th century, but Neoclassicism is about returning to very traditional forms. So you're focusing on restraint, balance, clarity, and using musical forms and features of early periods, specifically the 18th century. So if it happened in the 1700s, very likely it will be reused, recycled, or re-emphasized by neoclassicists. Two neoclassicists would be Paul Hindemith, this is Hindemith, and Igor Stravinsky, and we will study Stravinsky in just a second. Again, we're reviving old forms, and even though it's focused on older forms, it's still going to sound very modern. So you're going to use all of the tone colors and key relationships or awkward key relationship techniques to organize 20th century music, that harmony and everything. That's going to be superimposed on top of a form that is more traditional. So format-wise, it's normal, more traditional, of course, but it may sound very modern. So why neoclassicism? Why did this appear? Well, it's a reaction against impressionists, who were very fluid and without form, and romanticism, which was more about expanding forms and going beyond the box. Many neoclassical pieces are actually influenced by Bach's music, so that Bach happened in the 1700s, it makes sense to go back to Bach. So even though it's called classicism, it doesn't go back just to classical music. It'll touch on some Baroque things as well. A lot of neoclassical music is absolute music, so it's non-programmatic. It does not associate itself with the story. And very often these pieces were written for small chamber groups, smaller instrumental groups, because you didn't have a lot of people who were in orchestras anymore. This is between 1920 and 1950. World War II happens in the middle of that, so there aren't necessarily a lot of people available for these productions. Okay, so elements of neoclassicism that you may want to remember. Neoclassicism is usually tonal music. However, there are some atonal neoclassical musics, and even though it's tonal, it may not sound normal, because again, we're putting a lot of modern influence with the classical styles. Neoclassicism can be defined as an attitude rather than a true style. And again, we're referring to the past, but still sounding modern. So what happens when you have a mixture of what is old and new? Well, there's a tension created immediately. The audience understands the format and they have particular expectations, but those expectations are avoided or subverted because of these new harmonies and rhythms. And neoclassicism in music was influenced by the writings of T.S. Eliot and the paintings of Pablo Picasso. Okay, next chapter. This is on page 390, looking at Igor Stravinsky. He lived from 1882, died in 1971, and he actually was friends with Picasso, hence this drawing by him. And this is of Stravinsky. So he was friends with Eliot and Picasso, so he knew a lot of cool people. And Stravinsky was born in Russia near St. Petersburg, actually in a really small village near the large city. But he went to college, went to a conservatory, but he also studied with Rimsky-Korsakov kind of on the side. He got his big break as a composer in 1909, and he was asked to compose music for the Ballet Russe, or the Russian ballet. The three ballets that he wrote are probably still some of his most famous works: Firebird, Petrushka, and The Rite of Spring. So he had to move around a lot, probably because of what was happening in the climate of Europe. You have World War I and II, and all sorts of other things. So he just kind of led the life of a nomad for a while. In World War I, he was in Switzerland. After that war, he moved to France until World War II broke out, and then he moved to America. So he keeps going further and further west. During the 20s and 30s, he was considered an international celebrity. He was constantly touring in Europe and America. Originally, his musical style, which progresses as he goes along, originally he was inspired by Russian music, but as he gets older, it becomes more objective. Towards the end of his life, he was living outside of LA, so he made it all the way to California. Looking at his style, in the 1950s, he makes a very strong change in his style, so he goes from Russian-influenced to a neoclassical period, and then in the 1950s, this is his late style, he starts to take an interest in 12-tone and atonality. He had an assistant that was working with him, and this assistant brought to him the works of Schoenberg, Berg, and Webern. And it's interesting that Stravinsky picks up on the 12-tone system because previous to that, while Schoenberg was still alive, Stravinsky wanted nothing to do with Schoenberg or his music. But after Schoenberg dies, this is like literally just a year after he dies, Stravinsky picks up the 12-tone system. So, not sure what happened there, but there you go. Unlike Schoenberg, Berg, and Webern, Stravinsky, who already had an international career and was basically a musical celebrity, he was able to make this 12-tone system, which is completely different from what a lot of people have heard, actually work for him, and he found success writing in this new style. Even in his late years, like up into his 80s, he was still touring and composing. And in his 80s, he actually got to go back to Russia for the first time in 50 years. And that was while Russia was was still the Soviet Union. But he was saying, the smell of the Russian earth is different. A man has one birthplace, one fatherland, one country. So even though musically he had taken a really big journey and had actually gone a long way away from his Russian roots, returning to Russia, he felt a lot of sentiment for his home country. Looking at his music, even though he writes in different styles during his career, we do know that he has some similarities that kind of are incorporated throughout. So he writes for voices, instruments, and particularly the stage. He has a lot of influence on younger composers when it comes to his innovative rhythms, harmonies, and tone colors, and you'll get to hear a little bit of that. His early ballets, so the three ballets, the Firebird, Petrushka, and the Rite of Spring, are actually based on Russian folklore and folk tunes, incorporate some folk tunes. And they all call for a large orchestra. And like many other composers, his instrumental demands kind of get smaller as time goes on. During World War I, he wrote for chamber groups with unusual combinations of instruments. And during that time, he was writing or incorporating ragtime rhythms in popular dances. So definitely we're seeing a lot of influence from his native country, but he also brings in influence from other countries, particularly America. Looking at his middle and late periods, so the neoclassical and 12-tone periods. Neoclassical period is the middle of his career, so it lasted from about 1920 to 1951. And again, neoclassicism, the style, was basically those same years, so maybe Stravinsky wrote the book on neoclassicism. That's up for interpretation, of course. But he liked to model a lot of his works after Pergolesi, like with his ballet Pulcinella, and even Mozart, looking at his opera The Rake's Progress. We're not going to study those pieces or anything from those, but he is looking back at previous composers from the Baroque and Classical eras. He liked to emphasize restraint, balance, and include some wit or some humor in that music. After that time, when he goes into like his third big category of his career, he goes away from the tonal center, introduces 12-tone music, so that's all atonal. He briefly works with atomized or really teeny tiny melodic lines and breaks those into short fragments, and that's how he approaches the 12-tone system. We're going to see another composer who does something similar. And he is constantly changing the tone colors and registers while working with those atomized sections, and that is to, again, just introduce new elements to a compositional process. Overall sound. All of this is italicized because it's all important. So again, he likes to work with tone colors, experiment there. A lot of the times they are dry and clear. We're definitely going to get a sense of that with The Rite of Spring. He likes to include a strong sense of beat, use irregular meters to keep the audience on edge. He will use ostinatos and other repeating patterns as an element of unity. So kind of like what we had back in the Baroque period when we were talking about unity of mood, he's doing something similar here. He will also incorporate more abrupt shifts, so like a sudden change, again to bring about an element of surprise and keep the audience on their toes. He will use new or novel harmonies, things that don't often occur harmonically in previous music at least. So these conventional chords sound unique. These chords may make sense in a theoretical sense, but they are unique because of the orchestration and tone colors. So even though the chord is normal, it sounds different because of how it's played or what's playing it. And again, he is influenced by lots of different things such as Russian folk song, Baroque melodies, Renaissance madrigals, and even tango. So anything and everything can be a source of inspiration. So looking on page 392, I believe this is where this information starts in your textbook. We are looking at The Rite of Spring. This was written in 1913, premiered in 1913, and it has a huge impact on 20th century music and even culture. It includes lots of harsh dissonances, a percussive orchestration, rapidly changing meters, offbeat accents that are almost violent, they're so striking, and ostinato, so those repeating patterns. He had this idea back 3 years previous while he was writing his first ballet, Firebird. Quote by Stravinsky, he says, "I saw in imagination a solemn pagan rite, wise elders seated in a circle watching a young girl dance herself to death. They were sacrificing her to propitiate the god of spring." So this is a sacrificial rite, honestly, the storyline is. And in the background, these are some of the original costumes based off of Russian, I guess, traditional folkwear. The Rite of Spring also falls into a category, another subgenre more or less, called primitivism. And in primitivism, it is a deliberate evocation of primitive power through insistent rhythms and percussive sounds. So it was a very small musical genre, we could say. It had no lasting impact musically. Probably the biggest impact it had was on The Rite of Spring. So Stravinsky and other artists did find inspiration from the movement. We see this with this painting by Picasso. So it didn't make a big impact on the world. But it does explain some of the things that we see in The Rite of Spring. So in the orchestra for The Rite of Spring, it's pretty big. It includes 8 horns, so that's a really loud sound, 4 tubas, and a large percussion section of 5 timpani, a bass drum, a tambourine, tam-tam, a triangle, antique cymbals, and a gyro. So lots of different sounds going on at once. There we go. You have this clip included in the playlist. You have a listening outline on page 395. Make sure that you watch at least until the dancing starts, because if you just listen to the introduction, you're going to get a completely different impression than what The Rite of Spring truly is. The introduction sounds a little bit normal compared to when the dancers come on stage. It's a complete change, kind of a 180 change. All right, so that is early Stravinsky. The next composition is from his neoclassical period. You have information on this on page 397. Yeah, 397 in your textbook, a listening guide on page 398. This is Symphony of Psalms, written in 1930, and it's tonal, and it's patterned off of a fugue. So remember the fugue form from the Baroque era. Stravinsky is pulling that into this work. It has 3 movements for chorus and orchestra, and oddly enough, it does not include any violins, violas, or clarinets, and those are pretty commonplace instruments for any orchestra. The text is in Latin, and it comes from the Vulgate Bible, which is the Latin Bible used by the Catholic Church, and it is supposed to evoke a sense of anything that is ancient and solemn. So the text for the first movement that y'all will listen to, in the Vulgate Bible, it is Psalm 38, verses 13 and 14. In the King James Version and other versions patterned off of that, this is Psalm 39, 12 and 13. So the text, which reads, Hear my prayer, O Lord, and give ear unto my cry. Hold not thy peace at my tears, for I am a stranger with thee, and a sojourner, as all my fathers were. O spare me, that I may recover strength, before I go hence and be no more. So you have Movement 1 of Symphony of Psalms in the playlist. All right, and I'll stop it here.